What does it mean when the most powerful military on earth sets a deadline, threatens total destruction, and then steps back from the edge? Tonight, the United States and Iran have agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. But the real story is not the pause in fighting. The real story is what got us here, who blinked first, and what the terms of this fragile agreement actually mean for American power, regional stability, and the future of the Middle East. The United States and Iran reached a ceasefire deal less than 2 hours before the deadline President Trump had imposed for Iran to meet his demands or else face wide-scale destruction. That alone should stop you in your tracks. Hours earlier, the world was watching the clock. And the question every analyst, every diplomat, and every intelligence agency was asking was the same: would Trump follow through? To understand what happened tonight, you need to understand how this conflict started and where the two sides have been standing for weeks. In April 2025, Iran and the United States began a series of negotiations aimed at reaching a nuclear peace agreement, following a letter from President Trump to Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Trump set a 2-month deadline for Iran to reach an agreement. After the deadline passed without an agreement, Israel attacked Iran, igniting a war between the two countries. That war, now entering its 39th day, has reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the entire Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz, the waterway at the center of this crisis, is a vital shipping route through which roughly 20% of the world's crude oil and liquefied natural gas usually travels. Iran's control over that strait has been its most powerful leverage point throughout this conflict. When Iran restricted shipping through the strait, it did not just threaten military operations. It threatened the global economy. Oil prices surged, markets buckled, and suddenly every government from Washington to Riyadh to Beijing had a stake in what happened next. For weeks, the two sides have been separated by a fundamental disagreement over the structure of any deal. The United States had put forward a 15-point framework through Pakistani intermediaries. Iran rejected the proposal, arguing that a ceasefire without a permanent settlement was insufficient. Iran came back with its own 10-point framework, and according to multiple international media reports, Tehran held firm on that framework for the entirety of the negotiation period. It did not budge. It did not compromise on its core structure. It simply waited. The Iranian proposal consisted of 10 clauses, which included a protocol for reopening the Strait of Hormuz, an end to all conflicts in the region, the lifting of sanctions, and reconstruction. But the full scope of Iran's demands goes much further than that. Iran's Supreme National Security Council stated that the proposal includes guarantees of non-aggression, continued Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz, and recognition of Tehran's right to uranium enrichment. The plan also demanded the lifting of all U.S. primary and secondary sanctions, the termination of UN Security Council and IAEA resolutions against Iran, payment of compensation, and the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from the region. Those are not modest demands. Those are maximalist positions that, if fully implemented, would represent a fundamental restructuring of American power in the Middle East. And for weeks, U.S. officials called them exactly that. On Monday, when the U.S. had already received Tehran's proposal, Trump called it a significant step, but not good enough. The question then became, what would change between Monday and Tuesday evening? The answer came through Pakistan. Negotiations between the U.S. and Iran picked up momentum over the past 24 hours, as Axios reported, with Pakistan serving as the primary mediator. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir played a decisive role in what followed. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif announced that the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America, along with their allies, had agreed to an immediate ceasefire effective immediately. He invited delegations from the U.S. and Iran to settle all disputes and continued diplomatic talks in Islamabad on Friday, April 10th. Both parties have displayed remarkable wisdom and understanding and have remained constructively engaged in furthering the cause of peace and stability, Sharif stated. Now here is where the strategic analysis becomes critical. There is a significant gap between how Washington and Tehran are each describing this agreement, and that gap matters enormously. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt described the ceasefire deal as a victory for the United States that President Trump and our incredible military made happen, arguing that the U.S. military campaign gave the administration leverage to engage in tough negotiations. President Trump himself said the U.S. had won a total and complete victory. Total and complete victory. 100%. No question about it, he told AFP news agency. Iran's government told an entirely different story. Iran's Supreme National Security Council, the country's top security body, confirmed the ceasefire but also portrayed the agreement as a victory. We convey glad tidings to the great nation of Iran that nearly all of the war's objectives have been achieved, and your valiant sons have driven the enemy into a state of historic helplessness and enduring defeat, the statement read. This is a striking divergence. Both sides are simultaneously declaring victory after the same deal. In diplomacy, when both sides claim they won, it usually means the agreement is deliberately ambiguous. And deliberate ambiguity is both the strength and the danger of what was agreed to tonight. The critical piece of language that defense analysts are focusing on is Trump's own statement. Trump wrote on Truth Social, "We received a 10-point proposal from Iran and believe it is a workable basis on which to negotiate." Almost all of the various points of past contention have been agreed to between the United States and Iran. That phrase, "almost all of the various points of past contention have been agreed to," is extraordinarily consequential. It means the United States has, at minimum, moved dramatically closer to Iran's position than it publicly acknowledged just 24 hours ago. The exact scope of what has been agreed and what remains in dispute will be the defining question of the Islamabad talks on Friday. Notably absent from Iran's proposal is any commitment to end its nuclear program, a long-standing priority for the Trump administration. That absence is not a small oversight. It is potentially the central unresolved issue of the entire conflict. It remains unclear where negotiations stand regarding Iran's position that it can continue its enrichment of uranium. Iran's ability to retain an active uranium enrichment program while securing a ceasefire and negotiations framework would represent a major strategic achievement for Tehran, regardless of what final deal eventually emerges. And then there is the Strait of Hormuz itself. Iran's offer to reopen the route is a key bargaining tool in negotiations. The proposed transit fee of around $2 million per ship reflects Tehran's attempt to monetize control over the strait while funding reconstruction efforts. Think carefully about what that means. The proposal envisions reopening the Strait of Hormuz to maritime traffic with a $2 million per vessel fee to be shared between Iran and Oman. Rather than direct compensation, Iran would use its share of transit revenues to rebuild infrastructure damaged during U.S. and Israeli attacks. In other words, Iran is seeking to transform control over a global energy choke point into a permanent revenue mechanism. That is not just a ceasefire condition. That is an attempt to institutionalize Iranian authority over a waterway that the entire world depends on. Trump's announcement marks the fourth time he has extended a deadline for Iran to either open the Strait of Hormuz or face consequences. He first issued such an ultimatum on March 21st, giving Iran 48 hours to comply or see its power plants obliterated. On March 23rd, just hours before the deadline, he gave Iran 5 more days, claiming negotiations were making good progress. On March 26th, he said the U.S. would hold off on its threat for another 10 days. Last weekend, with that 10-day timeline set to expire on Monday, Trump extended it to Tuesday without stating a clear reason. Each extension viewed in isolation can be explained by diplomatic necessity. Viewed together, they form a pattern that Iran's negotiators clearly recognized and exploited. The broader international dimensions of this ceasefire should not be overlooked. President Trump said he believes China helped get Iran to negotiate a ceasefire. "I hear yes," Trump said when asked by AFP if Beijing had been involved in pushing Tehran to negotiate on a truce. A spokesperson for the Chinese embassy in Washington told CNN that since the conflict began, China had been working to help bring about a ceasefire and end to the conflict. China's involvement here is geopolitically significant. Beijing has long sought to position itself as a credible mediator in Middle Eastern conflicts. Its influence over Tehran gives it leverage that Washington cannot easily replicate. And its role in this ceasefire adds another dimension to the already complex rivalry between the United States and China for strategic influence across the broader region. Israel's reaction adds yet another layer of complexity. Netanyahu, the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and political allies like Senator Lindsey Graham had urged Trump to reject any proposal unless Iran made major concessions. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said the ceasefire in the Iran war does not include Lebanon, where Hezbollah militants are located and which Israel has invaded. Israel supports President Trump's decision to suspend strikes against Iran for 2 weeks, subject to Iran immediately opening the straits and stopping all attacks on the U.S., Israel, and countries in the region, the Prime Minister's office said. Israel is threading a needle here. It is publicly supporting the ceasefire while simultaneously carving out the right to continue military operations in Lebanon. That position is unlikely to be stable. Alex Vatanka, director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute, noted that while there are significant gaps between the U.S. and Iranian positions, there is potential for agreement, especially on a permanent ceasefire. They're talking in a way that you at least have the ability to agree on a basic framework that you then have to build on, he said. That is a measured but important observation. A framework is not a deal. It is the beginning of a deal. And the distance between a framework and a finalized agreement can be measured in months, in political will, and in the willingness of both sides to make concessions that they have publicly vowed never to make. So where does this go from here? There are several credible scenarios. The Islamabad talks on Friday could produce a genuine diplomatic breakthrough, with both sides using the 10-point and 15-point frameworks as complementary building blocks toward a lasting settlement. In that scenario, the ceasefire holds, the Strait of Hormuz reopens, and the region enters a cautious but real period of de-escalation. The U.S. and Iran are expected to hold peace talks on Friday in Islamabad, with Vice President Vance likely to lead the U.S. delegation. Alternatively, the ceasefire could fracture before formal talks even begin. After the ceasefire came into force at 8 p.m. ET, missiles were still launched from Iran towards Israel and several Gulf states. Whether those were pre-ceasefire launches or deliberate violations, their occurrence within hours of the announcement signals just how volatile the situation remains. Any single incident, any misidentification, any hardliner on either side who chooses escalation over diplomacy could unravel what was announced tonight. A third scenario is perhaps the most likely in the near term. The ceasefire holds for its 2-week duration. Talks begin in Islamabad. Both sides use the negotiations to buy time, consolidate their positions, rebuild domestic political support, and wait to see who blinks in the next round. That outcome would not be failure, but it would not be peace. It would be a managed pause in a conflict that still has no clear resolution on its most fundamental questions. Who controls the Strait of Hormuz? What happens to Iran's nuclear program? And what does American power in the Middle East actually look like after this war? Trump has for years attacked former President Obama for sending hundreds of millions of dollars in unfrozen Iranian cash to Tehran as part of the 2015 nuclear deal. So the idea that he would agree to sending reparation money to Iran appears far-fetched. And yet the same administration is now engaged in exactly the kind of high-stakes negotiation it once derided. That is not hypocrisy so much as it is the relentless logic of geopolitics. Wars have a way of forcing choices that peacetime rhetoric never anticipated. What is clear tonight is this: the world came extremely close to a catastrophic escalation. As one Middle East analyst put it, you have a window here to prevent disaster, and we were very close to it. The idea of what Trump was talking about would have been disastrous for the whole region. That window is now open. Whether it leads to a room or to another corridor of conflict depends entirely on what happens in Islamabad on Friday and in the weeks that follow. The question that every strategic analyst is now asking is not whether the ceasefire holds tonight. The question is whether the United States and Iran can find, within Iran's 10 points and America's 15, the narrow common ground that makes lasting peace possible. History says that is enormously difficult. But history also says that the alternative is worse. And that perhaps is the most sobering lesson of this extraordinary moment.